Sometimes the most innovative companies within an industry fall into decline over time. It's really simple. A thing worked and it worked really well, so why not keep doing it? If it worked for grandfather, why won't it work for grandson? It's like the local golf club that treats the old guys really well and then the kids get treated like crap, speaking from personal experience. Of course, there's more than one simple reason why the British motorcycle industry died. I've talked about certain motorcycles taking down other motorcycles, though there is an element of truth there. That kind of talking really only gets at the surface. Sure, the Japanese made more reliable, easier to use, and in many ways better performing motorcycles than the British, but why is that? Why were Triumphs and BSAs leaking oil all over the place well into the 70s, while companies like Honda and Yamaha had figured out how to make oil-tight engines years earlier? But it's still so much more than just good old capitalism at play, more than just better products at a cheaper price. And to really understand why Triumph and BSA and Norton and every other great British motorcycle company died, we have to go back further into their history. For reference, if you want a great but rather academic work on this topic, check out this book called The Strange Death of the British Motorcycle Industry. I'll put a link down below for you guys if you want to buy it. It's really good, really detailed, very long, but really explains everything. Now, the main thing to understand is that foreign competition, namely from Japan, but also from Italy and Germany prior to that, was really the icing on the cake for the British motorcycle industry as a whole. If Honda did kill companies like Triumph, it was one of those kills similar to Fortnite where an opponent is already dropped and crawling on the ground and you just shoot them and finish them off. The writing was on the wall already by 1969 when Honda released the CB750, even though the 60s was the peak decade for sales among companies like Triumph. I mean, by 1969, almost all the British companies were basically gone. And as we'll see, Triumph's success in the 60s was really a smokescreen. By 1925, the British motorcycle industry was dominating the world market, producing and exporting more motorcycles than all other countries combined. The industry was known primarily for innovation in design and performance. Companies like Norton and Triumph and BSA, along with many other smaller but sometimes even more impressive companies. Moving into the 30s, the major British companies were known for offering sort of a motorcycle for everybody. These companies had the most extensive lineups in the world, from small displacement singles to large twins and even 4-cylinder platforms. Think motorcycles like the iconic Square 4 by Ariel, available to the public all the way back in 1931. This was a 4-cylinder sort of superbike of its day. But it was large displacement motorcycles that really dominated the home market in Great Britain. People actually used motorcycles the way that Americans were using cars, and even a big motorcycle with a sidecar attached, brand new, was still a much cheaper alternative to a car. By the end of the 1930s, the British motorcycle industry was led by the so-called Big Six, with BSA at the head, followed by companies like Triumph, Matchless, Norton, Ariel, and Enfield cycles. And much of their success came from shared components, from Dunlop tires to Lucas Electrics. Each of these companies, along with many, many others that were somewhat short-lived, each had their own diverse and sort of tumultuous history. The main aspect of the industry as a whole during this time was a focus on building the highest performing motorcycles in the world. The standout company from this time, however, is without a doubt BSA. They existed as so much more than just a motorcycle manufacturer, and they were governed by an experienced and diverse board. And because of this, BSA offered the single most comprehensive motorcycle lineup in the world at this time. And this is part of the reason why BSA survived as long as they did, though not without problems. BSA was also one of the only British motorcycle companies to really have a mass-produced, almost Ford-level production of a motorcycle and of a small motorcycle with the BSA Bantam. This really is the only internationally popular small British bike with a massive run. Nothing in comparison to the later Japanese small bikes, but still the most sold British motorcycle of all time at about 250,000 units from 1948 to 1970. It was a true great first motorcycle for riders all over the world and a true one of a kind for this British industry. Now, during the pre-war era, most of the other British motorcycle companies besides BSA, both big and small, were ran by true enthusiasts and often people who had racing experience. Leaders who had a direct hand in design and development. Think iconic figures like Edward Turner, who again designed the innovative Ariel Square 4 and then the Triumph Parallel Twin. These companies' sort of legend and ultimate demise was in part because motorcycle enthusiasts don't always make for the best businessmen, especially in an ever-changing market. The relentless focus on bigger, faster, higher-performing motorcycles in that pre-war era, which was really the thing that made these companies successful, would ultimately lead to their downfall. Now, their main competition before World War II came from two places, Germany and USA. And then post-war, it would come primarily from Italy and then most of all from Japan. It was almost a precursor to Great Britain's struggles post-war, Germany sort of being like Japan in the pre-war era in that they succeeded in making lots of different small capacity motorcycles that were popular while the British companies just kept focusing on bigger machines. Post-depression, the British and worldwide motorcycle industry took a massive hit in part because of the economy, but primarily due to the increasing affordability and ease of the automobile as cars got cheaper and easier to use with electric starts and complete wind protection. Motorcycles remained relatively unchanged and continued to need regular upkeep. There is just no denying that the automobile industry advanced so much faster than the motorcycle industry. The motorcycle industry predated the automobile industry, but cars just outpaced motorcycles in terms of design and innovation. The general public was beginning to find motorcycles annoying, loud, and unsafe, and there began talk of how the motorcycle could evolve into something for everyone. And it's not that the British companies didn't try. They did, especially to get more female riders, but all of their publicity prior to World War II was essentially a failure. It wasn't necessarily their fault, but whatever the reason, it did little to boost the number of women riders during this time. It certainly didn't help that female riders were often banned from racing in Great Britain. Norton at one point boasted in the fact that they kept their female workers to a minimum to avoid a loss in quality and craftsmanship, apparently. Jeez. There was also the notion in the general public that riding a motorcycle was too physical of an activity for women. But the main problem going into the war and then after the war within the remaining motorcycle companies in Great Britain was pretty simple. I mentioned the notion of what's good for grandfather should be good enough for grandson, but it's more than that. What wasn't good for grandfather must also not be good for grandson. Essentially, small capacity machines hadn't worked for the British companies before the war to get more riders and also to get more female riders, so they doubled down after the war with a focus on big bikes, not realizing that the market was there to make solid, reliable little bikes for the masses. Companies were already doing it, and the British, they just weren't doing it well. Continuing to make big, fast motorcycles for sort of hardcore motorcyclists is one of the primary reasons they lost the battle to the Japanese and Italian competition in the 60s and 70s, and this comes from that pre-war era of reigning in the worldwide market by making bigger, faster, and race-winning motorcycles. Now, I should note that it's not that the British never tried making small motorcycles or scooters. They absolutely did, and some were somewhat successful. I mean, we do have the BSA Bantam, like I said, but the British companies, they never could get scooters right, and there could be multiple reasons. First, they really couldn't compete with the Italian imports on price, but they also just couldn't nail the look. Italian scooters just looked so much better. And, the British companies, because they didn't really care that much, their attempt at making scooters was haphazard, and they didn't really promote them the same way that they did their big bikes. The epitome of peak British motorcycle production after the war was Vincent's big twin Rapide and Black Shadow. I've made an entire video about this company and this motorcycle that you guys can watch, but know this: it was the fastest and remained for decades one of the fastest two-wheeled machines in existence, holding the land speed record for top speed for decades. Now, Triumph was actually in the best position coming out of World War II, especially for international markets. The 500cc parallel twin, dating back to the late 30s, was the best platform available from any British company. In fact, all the other British companies at this point were scrambling to produce an equivalent machine. This is the tried and true platform that would ultimately lead to the Bonneville, one of the last great British motorcycles prior to their collapse. Now, Triumph made a relatively genius but maybe detrimental move during this time. They started focusing on imports to the USA, and it wasn't long before Triumph's 500 and 650cc twins were competing with the likes of Harley and Indian in America, and in some areas outperforming them. To put it simply, Triumph didn't diversify to smaller capacity and just more options for motorcycles. They just took their big motorcycles to the place where everybody liked big motorcycles, where there was a big open road for people to ride big bikes. And Triumph's offerings, especially in the West Coast, really were a breath of fresh air over the heavier and slower and rather agricultural options for American companies. Now, Harley didn't like this, and there was actually a ruling by the American government at this time. Harley was trying to make it so that this would be impossible for companies like Triumph, but the government actually found in their studies that Triumph was not taking customers from Harley, but was creating a whole new market in America, a whole new sort of group of riders, in the same way that Honda did with their small bikes years later. Into the 60s, the American market became really the only market for British motorcycles. They weren't doing well at home at all, and exports virtually everywhere else were just way down. Companies like Norton and BSA and Triumph were making motorcycles that were expensive and essentially useless for most of the world, but in the States, they were the epitome of cool. You've got, of course, famous people like Steve McQueen and Bob Dylan and Clint Eastwood all riding Triumphs. Triumph's big twins made ideal platforms for customization and desert racing in the West Coast. The Bonneville was a massive hit in the 60s, a true motorcycle right off the showroom floor that could easily accelerate quickly to 120 miles per hour. British success in the States during this period really only prolonged the inevitable though. At home, the Japanese invasion had begun, and in many ways, the success in the States was almost a distraction from the real problem. It really only made companies like BSA and Triumph double down on making big, high-performance, fast motorcycles because they finally had a market. It wasn't a long-term solution, especially as the British companies failed to innovate and make even their big motorcycles really accessible to an ever-changing market. The speed and weight of these machines was never really the problem. Reliability and usability and ease of use was the problem, and a complete lack of diversity of lineup compared to the likes of Honda and Yamaha. By the late 60s, Honda was making motorcycles for every rider, and when Honda went from making medium and small displacement bikes and took that sort of same game plan and aimed it at the large displacement segments, of course, they knocked it out of the park. And it was all but over at this point for the British companies. Like we said, the icing on the cake. Now there was competition, real competition, for the British companies' only offering, which is big bikes. Enter the Honda CB750, arguably the first Japanese superbike, although the CB450 was already competing with the likes of the British big twins. Now, technically speaking, a Triumph Bonneville or BSA Lightning or Norton Commando could hang with the likes of a Honda CB750 in almost any setting besides a straight line, though some report that a Norton Commando actually had a better quarter-mile stock. But the CB750, like its smaller family members in the Honda lineup, had an electric start, a front disc brake, oil-tight engine, reliability like nothing else available, and just technical sophistication like nothing that had ever come out of a British motorcycle factory. Oh, and it didn't really cost any more, like $14.95 for the 69 CB750 versus 69 Bonneville, which is about the same price depending on where you were. Over time though, the 750 would actually start to beat the British competitors on price. The final great British motorcycle was arguably the Norton Commando, finally a British bike with all the soul and character of the industry, but finally repping some somewhat modern technology with a flair and innovation, especially in terms of frame design. The Commando was named Motorcycle of the Year 5 years in a row, and it's because it was a great motorcycle. It did so many things better than any other bike at its time, but even that bike continued to leak oil, continued to utilize bad Lucas electrics. It was thoroughly British, which was awesome, but still too British for the mass markets. The last of the big six, which was now the big three, Triumph, Norton, and BSA, all combined in the 70s into one company. I guess you could call it the big one at this point. Norton, Villiers, Triumph. Basically, Norton combined now with BSA, who already owned Triumph. And this was essentially a government-owned attempt at saving the industry, and it didn't work. The final motorcycles released out of Great Britain in the 70s weren't good, besides the Norton Commando. Even the overall design and aesthetic was lost in those final years from companies like Triumph, making it virtually impossible to justify buying a Bonneville versus all the other better options. I mean, think about some of the motorcycles available in, say, 1975 when the Bonneville was winding down. Not just the vastly improved CB750, but also the CB500 and CB550 and Kawasaki Z1 and H2. By the mid-70s, the British big bikes were just way behind. Now, it could be possible that the leftover British motorcycle companies could have lived on as sort of boutique, expensive enthusiast motorcycles, but that wasn't really as much of a thing at that time. Companies like MV Agusta can make it work today, but it didn't work for MV Agusta at that time. You know, they were selling their big expensive bike for like $6,500, which was the cost of a small house, and it didn't work. Through all of their struggles, the British companies often blamed their government for not protecting them when it came to foreign imports. And it is true that they didn't get the protection that some governments have provided, but they did get a lot of protection. But really, it all came down to a failure to both innovate and really to understand the potential market. Think about the small displacement offerings from a company like Triumph in the 60s. Their smallest bikes were the Tiger and Mountain Cub, cool little motorcycles when you look at them in retrospect for sure. But compare a bike like a 65 Tiger Cub with Honda's 1965 Cub. The Triumph is just a small motorcycle, not really geared in any specific way for a different audience who might like a different kind of motorcycle altogether, but at the same time, not really motorcycle enough for sort of the enthusiasts and the people who wanted proper motorcycles. Perhaps worst of all, it just looks too much like a normal motorcycle. More importantly though, it functions like a traditional motorcycle with a traditional clutch and gearbox. I mean, it's just a baby Bonneville in the end, and nobody really wanted that. The Honda Cub, however, changed the motorcycling world with radically effective advertising, perfect delivery on what was being advertised, an unassuming, simple, easy to use, reliable, small displacement motorbike for the masses with a 3-speed, essentially clutchless transmission offered in multiple sizes, and you could run around all day on a nickel of gas. Maybe not anymore. Might cost you more than a nickel to run around all day, but it did get amazing gas mileage. The Honda Cub was reliable in a way that the British companies couldn't fathom, and unintimidating in a way the British companies didn't understand. Even myself today, as someone who likes sort of traditional proper motorcycles, I struggle to see why the Honda Cub is the most popular motorcycle and vehicle of all time. But guess what? I'm not everybody. And when I think about it, I guess I can see how the general public may want something different than what I want. I'll take the Triumph Cub any day. But in terms of the whole market, I'm in the minority. The British motorcycle industry didn't understand this in those final decades. Now, obviously, there's more to it than just the kinds of motorcycles they offered. The company struggled from poor management and organization, bad worker relations. Also, some of the great iconic figures like Edward Turner made matters worse in the later years, stirring up competition and dissension between former rival companies that really needed to work together to survive this time. Management and manufacturing and everything in between was a mess compared to the likes of the Japanese companies. As Jay Leno points out in his video on his Bonneville, he talks about how the way that the bikes were imported to the USA just was a sham compared to the way the Japanese bikes were imported. The Japanese bikes came complete, and the British bikes came a little bit more in pieces and were put together. And because of this, there was reliability issues, and they didn't have the customer service and sort of ability to back up their warranties the way that the Japanese bikes did. Basically, it was a bunch of small things that really did add up. The British motorcycle industry failed primarily because they didn't do their job. The main job industry leaders have is to move things forward, to look 5, 10, 20, 30 years into the future and make products for those riders. That's how you lead an industry. Now, it should be said at this point that this video is primarily geared towards understanding why they failed, but remember, some of the greatest motorcycles of all time, motorcycles that paved the way for the future, came from the British industry. We wouldn't have all of the great Japanese bikes of the 70s and 80s and onward if it wasn't for the British companies making the most innovative bikes of their time. But this really should be a lesson and sort of a word of caution for current motorcycle manufacturers. You can't just keep doing the same thing, even if that thing once worked really well. Few of the big British companies really made new motorcycles in the last 30 years, and we have a lot of companies today that aren't making new motorcycles. They're just kind of making the same old things or rehashing and reusing the same platforms. Triumph made the Trident in those last years, but that was a total failure. Other than that, they just kept making and pushing the same motorcycle year after year after year with only small improvements, without really looking forward towards the next big, great, different motorcycle. Today, we stand at a similar crossroads as electric and autonomous vehicles appear to be taking over and really becoming the future. The future of motorcycling isn't known at this point. It could be that motorcycles become even less a mode of transport and even more of an accessory or a toy. And for that reason, maybe off-road should be the primary focus of every manufacturer. Regardless, it's not time to sit back and keep making the same motorcycles. And maybe this is the biggest lesson. Sometimes innovation means more than making bigger and faster. Maybe it's the little things, keeping those untapped markets out of the community, that makes the real difference. I wonder which of the big motorcycle manufacturers today are making the same mistakes Triumph and